So every culture is different. But I have my neighbours and my family also. Husbands were murdered, known as allegiance to your government. And they didn't answer our letters. They said, this is not a serious issue. It can wait. First we have to sort out the conflict, the end of this conflict. And we said, you know what? This conflict would have been much, much worse had the women in the communities not created peaceful places. Had we not spoken to each other across the community. Had we not formed a women's movement that brought everyone in together and fought for each other's rights when it was difficult to do so. So we said we maybe have something to add to this process. Not only creating a more inclusive process, as you call it now in Colombia, democratic expansion. I heard that word yesterday for the first time, because we were using the word democratic deficit about who was not at the table. And so we also said, not only would we like the process to be an inclusive one, but we need good substance. So, in 1998, I became one of 4% of women around the world to be a signatory to a peace agreement. We were the only 2 women at that table at peace talks. And we said, we will have a different substance in this peace agreement. We can add to this peace agreement. I want to congratulate Colombia today. I made a mistake in those talks. We only paid tribute to victims, and we only heard the victims' voices on the very last nights. It was a terrible mistake. Had I to go back again, I would now put a full chapter on victims' rights. But had there not been any women at that table, there would not have been one word in our agreement on victims. We succeeded in getting 2 sentences into that agreement on victims, mainly because the women who were in my coalition was a little political party from both sides of the community, had said, we also are victims. This peace agreement will be held up as a terrorist charter if there's nothing in this agreement about victims. And it was a lesson I learned very well when I went out in the Plaza and I knocked doors around the country and I drove a bus with my children and everybody else's children, and we knocked thousands and thousands and thousands of doors. This was before social media, when you had to get out and walk the streets, and walk in the villages, and walk in the towns, and stand in the corner with loudspeakers, and explain to the people what was in the agreement. And I have to say to you that when politicians make an agreement, it's not just public servants that implement it. It's everyone. It's civil society, it's the trade unions, it's the women's sector, it's the business sector. And here I think in Colombia that message needs to be heard. Everyone has to own this agreement. Everyone has to see themselves in this new peace process. We were successful. And I'd also tell you that on the nights, the very final nights of our peace agreement, I looked at this agreement and said, where is human rights? What are we saying about human rights and equality? Which was the whole reason for us having 30 years of conflict. And can we get anything into this agreement about the rights of women? Again, the political parties told us, be quiet. In fact, they said much worse. And we said, okay, we'll agree on one right, the right of women to full and equal political participation. And then we agreed a whole series of other rights, which, if you ask me questions later, I can tell you what they all were, because they reflected the nature of our conflict. And we also had a few words in about public participation and the right of women to decision-making in the new country, in the new society. That was it. That was it. And a few rights on what victims might need. But we felt it was enough. And we felt ourselves in the bag. And it was only when I read Colombia's agreement, and I said, I wish they had been at our table. I was so proud when I saw your agreement. How comprehensive it is, how it speaks to human rights, how it talks about the indigenous people, the campesinos, it talks about women, it talks about a gender approach to peace building. Where did you find this in Colombia, that you did this? You should stand proud. I will now be taking this agreement to Sudan, where I will be in 2 weeks. I will take your agreement everywhere I go, and I will say, had I done this 20 years ago, my job might have been easier as I proceeded to become the Human Rights Commissioner. So in the 1990s, I left politics. I went back to the university, and the Human Rights Commission was established. And no one wanted the job. It was considered the most difficult job in the country to be the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commissioner. I was very happy to go home. I was a mother with small children. I had domestic duties. I had a day job. I had many things to do. I did not want to go back into public life where everybody on social media gives you lessons about how you should behave. But I did it. The advertisement went out to the newspapers. It was a public advertisement. The commissioner had to be independent of politics and independent of Parliament. The commissioner had to be interviewed by independent people. And the commissioner had to go through a very difficult process before they decided who should be the new commissioner. I had followed the previous commission that had collapsed because they could not agree on whose human rights. And I knew this was going to be one of the most difficult jobs I would ever do. I was also given the mandate from the Good Friday Peace Agreement. We call it Good Friday Belfast Agreement because we cannot still agree on the title. 18 years later, we have to call it Good Friday, stroke Belfast. Catholics call it Good Friday, Protestants call it Belfast. We don't say Catholics or Protestants anymore. We talk about our political identity. We talk about our right to be British or Irish or both. Because the conflict was really fought over political identity. It wasn't really about religion. But that's how it's symbolized. So when I sat down to draft the Bill of Rights, I was told the only rights that you need to draft are the right to be British or Irish or both. And you need to put some constitutional rights in. But that's it. And I said, I would be ashamed to draft a Bill of Rights in this country after 30 years of conflict that did not speak to children, to the disabled, to victims, to older people, as well as those in prison, as well as those being interrogated by the police or the army. So it wasn't just rights about torture or the human rights violations that everyone speaks about as a result of conflict. But I wanted this bill to be a democratic, pluralist Bill of Rights for the future of Northern Ireland. I succeeded in drafting it, and I handed it to the government 2008. It was the Human Rights Day, December 10th, 2008. And it has sat in the British Parliament ever since. They have never taken it forward. So there is a mistake in our peace process, because they said, unless all of your politicians in Northern Ireland agree the rights in this Bill of Rights, we in Westminster don't need to bring forward legislation. And the more difficult part, as you probably heard, is the United Kingdom has now voted to leave the European Union. So I don't even have any rights now to fall back on, because we have the European Convention of Human Rights. But if Britain, the United Kingdom, leaves that convention, which it says it's going to do, which is a separate process from Brexit, then Northern Ireland's peace agreement could be precarious, in that the very foundation of that agreement was built on human rights. The final pieces of my job as Human Rights Commissioner was to investigate human rights violations. Again, I had a very difficult task in that in my very early days, the police had arrested 14 men for terrorism on one day and put them all into a police station. And I had the power, which is a very strong power, to ring the police constable and say, I am coming in this afternoon just to interview and to take testimony from all 14 detainees, who at this stage had been held for 6 weeks without charge, because the new counter-terrorism legislation in the United Kingdom said that you could hold people up to 6 weeks. This was a small police station. They were not allowed freedom of association. They could not speak to each other. They could not speak to anyone outside of the police station. They couldn't phone their families. They had a right to a solicitor, and they were not allowed to walk outside to get fresh air. So I did an investigation, and I said, the good part of this is they have not been tortured. The most important part of this is that it has been a transparent investigation, interrogation, compliant with human rights. But there are a number of rights that the police have failed on. And immediately people in the country commended the report. They could trust now that we were not going to fall back into old habits, where people had been tortured before in prison, where there had been a violation of their rights in prison, that they hadn't had access to a lawyer. And I observed, I was allowed to observe all of this. It was a very powerful power, the right to go in and investigate at short notice. And I also had this right to do the same thing in prisons. The other powers I had was the power of advising government on all its legislation, to make sure it was compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights, which, as I just said, if that convention falls, that duty will be taken. But again, parliamentarians and the ministers of government respected me whenever I said to them, there's a problem with your legislation. It is not compliant with this article of the European Convention. So we followed what you probably understand to be the Paris Principles. These are the international principles established for national human rights institutions. And two other tasks were education and litigation. I have taken many cases to court, I've acted as a third party in the court, where I see that this case is of public interest. I do not need a victim. I can go in as the Human Rights Commissioner and argue the case through my lawyers. I've gone all the way to the European Court, taking those cases. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose. But we have to be very careful in terms of the cases we take, because there can be unintended consequences if you do lose. So we select our cases very carefully and make sure that they're of public interest. And in terms of education, any country coming out of conflict, that can be the most important role of all in terms of human rights. People expect Human Rights Commission to be human rights defenders. They should be human rights educators. So we go into the schools, we teach the children a new curriculum based on human rights. We're now able for the first time ever to talk about the causes of the conflict. No one could talk about the causes because no one agreed on the causes. One half of the community saw it as a group of criminals terrorizing the community. The other half of the community saw it as domination and subordination and a lack of rights. So the teachers are now doing a good job, supported by the Commission and documents that we produced. Hear me, support me, protect me, respect me. If we do that in Northern Ireland, we truly do know that we have created a much more successful peace process. Tomorrow, I speak at your peace conference, and I will be talking and addressing peace officers on the massive transition that we have made. It has been the main success of our process. We're still working on reconciliation. We're still working on good governance arrangements. We're still working on something I think you might do better than us, on social and economic rights, in terms of what I see in your agreement, because ours was mainly on political and civil rights. So again, I congratulate Colombia for including rights in terms of education and healthcare and land, which we did not do, mainly because we didn't have the issue of displacement and land as you do. But we had other issues of social and economic inequalities that we still have to address. But the reforms of criminal justice and policing have been our most successful. And mainly because we have really implemented the words of protection, prevention, and promotion. And today our police officers are held to the highest standard of accountability. No one has been killed in Northern Ireland in 10 years. No police officer has drawn his gun without knowing that he will be held accountable for drawing his gun before even shooting. And even with a taser, he is held accountable by the police ombudsman, who also has the responsibility to take complaints and to make investigations. These are incredibly strong powers. So my final message to you would be this. The peace agreement is only a form of words. The peace process, if it's going to be successful, has to be the enforcement and the action on the ground, seen by the people who then believe they have a peace dividend. And that means the ownership of the people in the new institutions. I'm very proud to say that today you heard my story as a teenager, marching for rights, being fired on with bullets, rubber bullets, plastic bullets, live bullets, and CS gas. I have lived long enough now to know my children will never have to face that, but I've also lived long enough to know that our institutions are working, are progressing, and we're very proud of them. Thank you very much.
Gracias, doctora McWilliams. Damos un espacio para preguntas y respuestas.
Gracias. Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Ana Rodríguez. Creo que soy la única sociedad civil que llegó a este lado de la calle. Pertenezco a la Alianza de Organizaciones Sociales y Afines, una de las 4 plataformas de derechos humanos que existen acá en Colombia. además de otras plataformas que trabajan el tema de víctimas, el tema de mujeres. Y creo que muchos de los hallazgos que usted encuentra sorprendentes en ese acuerdo son el producto del trabajo de las organizaciones de derechos humanos y de mujeres para lograr una exigibilidad en esos temas. Sin embargo, seguimos teniendo problemas, pues siguen las amenazas y los asesinatos a defensoras y defensores de derechos humanos, especialmente en los territorios, y muchos de ellos siguen en la impunidad. Actualmente hay algunos procesos de diálogo, entre ellos la mesa de garantías para defensoras y defensores, pero lamentablemente los procesos judiciales no tienen la celeridad y los resultados que quisiéramos ver, y por eso seguimos planteando que hay una gran impunidad al respecto. Por eso, desde la Alianza y desde algunas plataformas hemos pensado que para mantener ese trabajo en derechos humanos es necesario el apoyo en dos temas que creo que ustedes pueden apoyar con su embajador ante el Consejo de Naciones Unidas, el señor Matthew, con quien ya hemos hablado previamente, pero cuyo respaldo, pues espero, haya sido modificado con las incidencias políticas como la del referendo con el tiempo. Y es que consideramos que la misión de Naciones Unidas que se despliega acá en Colombia debe tener un componente de verificación de derechos humanos, no solamente de cese al fuego, y que debe verificar que esos derechos humanos sean no solamente para los combatientes, sino precisamente para las comunidades, las organizaciones, la sociedad civil en general. Lo segundo es también respecto a toda la Unión Europea, el proceso de cooperación para la construcción del proceso de paz es un proceso que se ha planteado como entre gobiernos, y claramente parte de la existencia de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil está basada en su independencia de los gobiernos, por lo menos ha sido la historia acá. Entonces sería importante que la cooperación que se le ofrezca a Colombia tenga una ventana para la sociedad civil y adicionalmente que tenga unos indicadores de derechos humanos. La experiencia que usted nos relata es esa, cómo los derechos humanos son la base del mantenimiento de la paz, y en este momento quienes hemos pensado que la salida negociada ha sido, pues, la apuesta siempre son los defensores de derechos humanos, y por eso hoy quiero pedir también que en la medida de sus posibilidades desde la Unión Europea se planteen estos puntos.
Do you want to address this or take a different one? Yeah, of course I can answer. Do you want to address it also? I think your issue of verification is essential. I learned that the hardest part of the peace agreement was the third stage, which was the implementation and enforcement. And of course you will have people saying, yes, we've done this, but you need independent international monitoring. And we set up a range of commissions. A commission to oversee the reform of policing, a commission to oversee the ceasefire, a commission to ensure, which I recently was on, the first woman to be on, was to monitor the disbandment of paramilitaries. 18 years after the agreement. We have a number of ombudsmen who have inside the country, as you heard me say, for compliance on human rights, on equality, on policing, on children, and equality. But over that, we set up another layer, which was the international verification. So it depends whether you have the United Nations. We didn't have the United Nations. So we went and found international people of integrity to walk the journey with us, and they were very well respected. Now we've got to the stage of being able to have some local people on those verification bodies. As I said, I was one recently, and will be, hopefully next month, on one for the next 4 years, which is to oversee the final pieces of our peace agreement, along with someone from David's government and someone from the British government. So we don't need any more to go to other countries. And that's a good sign when you start being able to find those trusted monitors inside. But initially, you need to have those outside. So I think we were asking for support on that proposal. And I certainly believe that it's a very sensible proposal. It makes lots of sense. And whether it's, you've asked for the United Nations to address this issue, as I understand your question. And it doesn't have to be the United Nations. You have the goodwill of other people from around the world now, as we did. So some of these individuals do not have to come from the UN. As we had many from Canada, Finland, South Africa, and even now Ireland would be a good critical friend to Colombia. On the second question on the European Union, I hope I understood you, which was, but I understood one part of this, which was the role of civic society. The European Union is an amazing organisation in that it has always promoted the third sector in its decision making. And it has civic society representation alongside the European Parliament. And I know the people who are on that. In my peace process, in our peace agreement, I proposed a civic forum. And I argued that this civic forum should be advisory to the new Parliament, the new legislative body. And it should be made up of people who made the peace process. And it should be from all the sectors of civic society. It was successful, it was in the agreement, and it was abolished. And it has never stood. Maybe for the first months after the government came together, the government said, no, the politicians are safe now. We can all talk, and we don't need this civic forum. So it was a mistake. Now it's trying to resurrect a civic forum again, and I think that's a good idea, but it needs to be inclusive and representative. So, if I understood your question on the European Union, it was supporting the role of civic society here in Colombia, and understanding that civic society has a crucial role to play in its implementation. David's right, politicians will not do this alone. Public servants will not do this alone. It also has to be civic society. And it will work, and it will be sustained if it's local ownership. And all the regions of Colombia, not Bogota, not the headquarters here, but the people down in the rural areas, right around the country, also have to be part of that. And there, to me, as I have in my journey around Colombia over the years, I've been so active. So they're the people that promoted the peace agreement, were active inside the peace process. They deserve their place in implementing that agreement. And I think it will be sustainable if the vision is there to see ways to include them. I hope I understood your question, but maybe you understood it differently.
Yeah, I did, and they get to the core of a number of challenges that Colombia will face. International monitoring is always a key component of that, and to the credit of the Colombian government, they went to the United Nations Security Council and asked for help in terms of monitoring and verifying the laying down of arms and the ceasefires. And there's a very strong political mission in Colombia and growing in Colombia to do that process. Colombia is slightly different though. It's not like Lebanon and Middle East where there's a different type of conflict which requires a different type of UN mission. It's a very specific case in point here. In many ways, Colombia didn't need to go to the Security Council, but they did, and I think it's to their credit that they have done that and brought that international component in. There's an awful lot of very, very good stuff already happening. For example, in the last few months, the mandate for the Office of the Human Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was renewed again. This is, the Human Rights Office here is the biggest office in the world. It is, and they do a tremendous amount of work. I'm pleased that Ireland over the last couple of years have funded directly the work of the office here. I mean, we fund the United Nations centrally through Geneva, but we specifically fund bilateral projects. And one of the projects that we supported in 2014 was the placement of a human rights, the OHCHR office in Armenia, and in particular to support the work that they were doing in Tumaco, which is a really, really difficult area. I did visit Tumaco and Pasto last year when I was here, and to see the scale of the impact of the conflict on victims is horrifying. And our guests will see it tomorrow when we go down to Putumayo as well. And I think the work that they do is really, really important. There are challenges around how this continues to go forward. And I think it will be difficult. Security Council is a very difficult place to get something through. Okay, I mean, the politics of the permanent members of the Security Council is very, very difficult. And it is remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that the 2 times that Colombia has gone to the Security Council, you had a unanimous vote to support the work of the peace here in Colombia. And part of that, I think there's better and easier ways of doing human rights monitoring during the laying down of arms and the concentration zones and all of that work. And that is better done through the work of the Office of Human Rights that's already here, rather than complicating a political process at the UN table. I hope I'm not speaking for turn here, Monica. But I think the way Colombia has approached this approach in terms of getting the balance between international observing and implementing the agreements here, I think they've done it very, very well. And that's reflected in that unanimous voice at the Security Council to support peace here. Just to move it forward into the EU role, I mean, the EU High Commissioner for External Affairs, Frederica Mogherini, was here back in July, I think, and subsequently, yes, it was just as the peace agreements were being announced, and she announced a package of about 500 million euros in support for Colombia. In that is a European Trust Fund for Colombia, which is, I think, only the second time the European Union has ever done that. They have done it for the Central African Republic as well. And again, it's a showing an absolute European commitment to supporting the peace process in Colombia. In doing that, we have different, as Europe, we have different mechanisms to support. And over the last couple of years, a key platform of the way the European Union has supported Colombia's process has to be work directly with civil society, creating peace laboratories in some key conflict regions that have enabled civil society and the different actors, from human rights defenders through to universities, to the church and the local government stakeholders, to come together and try and envisage what peace would mean in those areas. And that will evolve, I think, into a much more considered engagement by the European Union in terms of how the trust fund will be spent and how it will be implemented. And I'm confident that the trust fund will be formally launched in the next couple of weeks, not to be reported outside of this room. And just, I have to say, in my time here, though I'm not resident here, I'm resident in Mexico, I want to say that the work of civil society is really inspiring. In the way civil society organizes itself, it's not a haphazard, randomly thematic area. The fact that you said you're from a platform in itself is a unique development. And I spent a lot of time, I think many people have heard about the Iguala case in Mexico 2 years ago, the scale of disappearances. And as a diplomat in Mexico, trying to work on human rights issues there, the only thing I can keep saying is, why can't Mexico do it the way Colombia does it? Because the work of the way civil society is organized, the way government is listened, the platform arrangements in terms of engaging on a thematic and structured basis, is really, really very, very impressive. And I know from a diplomatic perspective, that's also that the Colombian government, and Monica particularly, here has done some great work in terms of the EU-Colombia high-level dialogue on human rights. And that was a key part and key component of the EU Colombia-Peru Free Trade Agreement as well, that human rights is a respected part of how we do business and how we do trade, because that's again some of the key problems that are in the regions. So there's a lot of good stuff put in place in the agreements. I think in many, many ways Colombia is far more advanced than you think in terms of, now I'm saying that conscious that there's an awful lot of difficulties, an awful lot of pain, an awful lot of victims, an awful lot of hurt, and sadly killings still continue. But in the context of the way you put the structures in place, it is a very, very impressive approach to it. And to be quite honest, as I did a lot in Mexico, I'm saying, can we not replicate the way the Colombians engage with civil society here? Because it's streets ahead of what I'm seeing there. And again, please don't put that on Twitter and do not quote the Irish diplomats in Mexico's human rights solicitor. Please don't do that, we'll make it fired. but I do believe that what you have done and what you've got so far is really, really impressive. And Monica may want to say something about the dialogue and the work that you're doing here, but I think you can count on the international community to support the process. You can count on the EU Trust Fund and there are mechanisms, the UN Trust Fund, of which we're contributing to both, to come on and support civil society and support the government in implementing peace. But it is a challenge, and it will be a challenge to overcome. I'm not saying it's ideal, things can get better, but we're starting from a very good level. And I think the work of the Human Rights Office will help in that regard.
Hola, primero agradecerles a ustedes por compartir la experiencia. Yo quisiera conocer la opinión de ustedes frente a un asunto que tenemos en nuestro país en términos de la interpretación y las discusiones sobre el enfoque de género. Una de las cosas que pasó el 2 de octubre con los acuerdos y el acuerdo que Mónica resaltaba con el enfoque de género que tenemos es que algunos sectores de la oposición de alguna manera interpretaron ese enfoque como un ataque como a las convicciones religiosas y familiares pues de diferentes sectores. Tú ahora nos contabas que en Irlanda del Norte parte del trabajo que se hizo para entrar como a hablar de derechos humanos de las mujeres era pues imponer, digamos, una reflexión sobre qué son derechos humanos, independientemente de la identidad, de la convicción religiosa y demás. Acá tenemos todavía un grupo importante de la población colombiana que todavía piensa que esos derechos de las mujeres y de la población LGTBI están de alguna manera cuestionadas en el acuerdo final por tener ese enfoque de género. ¿Cómo podríamos recoger de la experiencia que ustedes tienen en Irlanda del Norte algunos elementos para aterrizar esas discusiones en términos de derechos humanos, separadas un poco, pues no sé si separadas, pero por lo menos no condicionadas a las convicciones religiosas, morales o ideológicas incluso?
You have no idea how similar Colombia is to Northern Ireland. It is exactly the same debate. Exactly the same. I am still, all these years later, 40 years later, still making that argument that you cannot juxtapose the right to religious freedom and think that it doesn't exist. It does exist, and we understand the need for freedom of religion. We, of all people, in Northern Ireland. But there are some in Northern Ireland who want to use that as a stick. So we are very similar to the debate that you had after the referendum. We do have civil partnerships, but we're the only part of the UK and Ireland that does not have same-sex marriage rights. Because Northern Ireland parliamentarians and politicians could not agree. And so in that respect, they're very similar. I think we would have had the same debate had there been the same confusion. I think what happened in Colombia was There were too many circumstances happening at the same time. You had the discussion on the schools, the discussion on the curriculum, the discussion on the peace agreement, and there was a lot of confusion. And the last thing you can afford when you're asking people to say yes is have them confused. So the best thing about the second piece of card is clarification. Because, of course, the spoilers and people who want you to say no are going to tell you the terrible things that are going to happen. And they will fill you full of fear, as they did in our situation. Those of us who had to say yes, it's much more complex. And those rights are complex rights. And to mix them all up and confuse them and get everyone to think, oh, it's the end of the world, it's the end of the family, it's the end of marriage, it's the end of human beings in terms of their sexuality. And it's easy to do this on Twitter and social media. I was reflecting today that we had been successful in our peace agreement if social media had been present. Because it's a great way to tell lies and make rumours become fact. I had a difficult enough time with the television and the broadcast and the print media, but we didn't have to deal quite as much as you did with the misinformation. So it's good that that has now been clarified. So please do not think for 1 minute that I'm making Northern Ireland to be the paradise of human rights. It is so far removed from that still. I tell my children, implementing human rights is an unfinished business. It goes on every single day. I was telling David at lunch, my children said to me the night I came home from the Good Friday Agreement, I was so tired. I hadn't slept for 3 days and 3 nights. And I just said, okay, it's time to go home. And my little one outside the house said he was on a skateboard. American culture had come to Northern Ireland. And he said to me, I said, we've made a peace agreement. Have you heard? And he looked at me and he said, Mum, for the last year you've been talking about nothing else. What difference does it make? So that was reality. And then I walked into my house and the older boy was sitting mesmerised on the television. And he could not believe what he had just heard. And he said, Mum, is it true? I said, it is. He said, does that mean there will be no more riots this summer over people parading through our community and other people protesting against the parades through our community? I said, no, it doesn't. We haven't dealt with that in the peace agreement. He said, does it mean that I will be able to walk safely through particular areas at night? I said, it certainly does not. And he said, and does it mean all the murders now will finish? I said, actually the opposite. This may be the time, like when a woman leaves a domestic violence relationship, that's the time she is very fearful of the man actually committing homicide against her. Because he says, if I can't have you, no one else will. And I used to say that at our peace table. I hope we all stay alive after we sign this agreement. Because those who don't want it to work will take our lives. And so it can be the most dangerous time. We got through that. But even 18 years later, I'm still telling those young men who are now adults that every mother judges progress by the age of their children. So they've grown up through the peace process. And they say to me, now, and it's very sad for me as a mother, I don't want to live in this country. I'm going away. It is too sexist. It's still sectarian. The attitudes are very narrow. And I've watched what they've done to you as a woman. And that's very hard because I want them to feel the opposite. But I hope someday they'll come home, that they will come back. But it's still, you can change a great deal of action, but it's the attitudes that will take the longest. And so what you went through after your agreement was a set of very aggressive attitudes. But I still felt very proud that when you went back in, I was so nervous that all of your gender principles would go out the window. And you still held them. But what you did was you clarified those rights. And you were able to show the balance of human rights. That this right does not be taken away, the right to religious freedom, but it should not be imposed on these other rights, so that human beings cannot have their lives lived with equality and dignity. So thank you for that question.
Just a quick follow-up. it prompted me to remember, actually, I think, roughly speaking, at this moment, this time last year, the Irish Parliament enacted the same-sex marriage legislation. So it's exactly 1 year to the minute, I think, almost. And that was on foot of a referendum that happened the previous May. And I think Ireland is probably still the only country in the world that has enabled same-sex marriage by referendum, by popular vote. Everywhere else it's been done through legislation in Parliament. And ironically, the world hasn't fallen apart in Ireland in the last year, despite what many on the low side would have said. And it did strike me, the champion of that referendum was a man called Eamon Gilmore. He was the leader of the Labour Party. He said one of the conditions of coming into power was that we will enact a referendum, or we'll have a referendum on same-sex marriage. And he's now your EU special envoy to the peace process. He's a man that deeply understands the issues around equality, deeply understands issues around gender perspective, and I fully agree with what Monica has said about keeping that there. What tends to happen, though, is in the heat of the debate, is stuff gets misreported, stuff gets misunderstood. And I think as the agreements develop and evolve, and I think even in the period since the plebiscite results, people have been reflecting and have been saying, actually this gender perspective thing is not as bad as we thought it might be. And I think that will change and evolve, and I think certainly from the European Union perspective, you have supporters and champions on that issue, and we're personally speaking very, very pleased that that's one aspect of the revised agreement from last weekend that hasn't been in any way jeopardised and continues to be strengthened. And I think, as Monica has pointed out from the Irish experience, by not including these perspectives at the beginning, we've had to go back 6, 7 times and renegotiate elements of the agreement, and helping us to move that forward. A more comprehensive agreement and a more comprehensive understanding and more nuanced perspective, including a gender perspective, would have helped us to make better progress, I think, at an earlier stage of the process. But like I said at the beginning, this is a process. All peace agreements have to be peace processes, and each is unique to the culture and the circumstances in which each country finds itself.
The one thing I'd also add in terms of women in peace processes is you can go backwards. We've gone backwards in Northern Ireland. Many things are working, but the right of women to full and equal political participation has never been implemented. It's been an aspiration. So it's taught me a lesson that I had to go back. I wouldn't write it as an aspiration. I'd put a timetable in, I'd put a target in, I'd put a benchmark in, and I'd ask for some political champions to make sure it happens. And the other thing is that there are as few women today in our judiciary, and the police are well improved. But in our political parliamentarians, we haven't increased that much. So the lesson from Nicaragua, from Vietnam, from South Africa may be less of an exception. Certainly from Northern Ireland, is be careful. Ask, where are the women now? So you manage to get that into your Colombian peace agreement. It will be a shining example to the rest of us in the world. But will it be enforced? Will it be implemented? And will the women be in the positions that they should be in? And that's the question I'll be asking the police tomorrow. Because they're part of this modernisation, they're part of this democracy, they're part of the new institutions. And you cannot go on the way you were before. So those are the questions to ask. Don't go backwards. Hold what you have, sustain it, maintain it, and progress it. And if that's a lesson from Northern Ireland, it's a lesson from a mistake in Northern Ireland.
Muchas gracias por compartir la experiencia de Irlanda. Mi nombre es Marjorie Vizcaíno, yo trabajo en la Consejería Presidencial de Derechos Humanos en los temas de mujeres y tengo dos preguntas que me gustaría que me pudieran compartir cómo fue la experiencia de Irlanda. La primera, ¿cuál fue el papel de la mujer específicamente en la incorporación del enfoque de los derechos de las mujeres en el acuerdo? Y ya posteriormente, durante la implementación, ¿cuál fue el papel estratégico de las mujeres durante todo este proceso? Y la otra pregunta es, ¿Cuáles fueron esas acciones estratégicas que se adoptaron para trabajar el tema de la no violencia contra las mujeres en el marco del postconflicto? ¿Cuáles fueron esas acciones estratégicas que les ayudó a ustedes como gobierno para prevenir y erradicar la violencia contra las mujeres?
Well, very briefly, because I think I've answered some of it earlier. Women were central to the peace accord, and it's good to hear around the world now people talk of Northern Ireland as an example. It was the role of women that led to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. They looked at what we had done in Northern Ireland in terms of facilitating peace, peace building and reconstruction. And I did not know this until many years later, that we had been a kind of a model for them building that into that Security Council resolution. I don't know if you knew that, David, but the drafters of that resolution said that they had looked to the success of the women. But we had to claim our space. No one invited us. No one went out and said there must be a parallel commission of women. No one said there should be a gender commission. We had to go out on the streets and ask people to elect us in a conservative, patriarchal country. And the people did elect us because they saw the dinosaurs hadn't made much difference. And so they gave us a chance because they saw us as speaking with a different voice, talking about peace in a different way, talking about our safety and security in a different way. So they did elect us, but we were elected. And that was difficult. And I was elected to the First Assembly, and then I lost my seat because the peace process went down. So Colombia's lesson is it can go up, go down, go up. I think we've gone up and down 16 times. I'm burned out. I hope it doesn't go down again. And that's why I was asked to monitor the paramilitary disbandment, because it almost did go down again last year over some murders that happened. So we've gone to the precipice, to the cliff edge and looked over, but we had enough sense to say, let's go, let's hold, let's not have a reoccurrence of the conflict. We tasted the prize of peace, as you will now do in Colombia. So there should not be a reoccurrence. And that's the strategic issue, is how much did we get into the agreement? Very little compared to Colombia. I mentioned that. We got 2 or 3 proposals. But also, here's the thing I'm proud of. Those were gender-specific proposals, but the women acted strategically on every other proposal. And that's why our Senator mentioned the chairperson of our talks actually paid tribute to the women. He said they did not just go in and fight for women's rights, they fought for right across the constitutional issues, the governance arrangements, the criminal justice and policing reforms, social and economic development. These are all women's issues. So it's not just siloing off the particular rights that we experience because we are women and the gender-based harms that we know about, but it's having a voice to speak to all of these other serious issues that make for peace. The strategic, I think I just answered the issue on the strategic action. We've been quite successful in violence against women. We have good strong legislation now, and it is being enforced, and the police are enforcing it. And the police, we have a police officer with us here, and she will tell you it's the #1 priority in Northern Ireland now. When you reorient from conflict to peace, it's a different kind of violence that you then pay attention to. And it's that violence also that causes terror. Everybody in this country talks about terrorists. I know a whole lot of terrorists who were never guerrillas. Guerrillas. You know, they were people, gentlemen. They were people who wore suits, who were street angels and house devils. And those women told me, because I did the first study 25 years ago on the impact of armed conflict on violence against women, I'm now repeating that study. So it's the first study that has ever been done over 25 years using the same methodology, going back and asking what difference did peace make? So those are the strategic questions. How did the police reorient themselves to violence against women when they didn't consider it a priority before? I think that's a big issue for you in Colombia. I got the impression in some of these meetings that they're not taking that very seriously. And that will be a reorientation from a force, a military force, to a service. They are the servants of the people, for the people. And if that's a big crime, then it needs to be policed. And that's what we learned. So on that we were successful. On the legislation we built it, and it is stronger. So if your specific question on that, we have some success. But the actual number of women, like Monica, in key high-level decision-making posts, minimal. There were a number of us who became role models, and that's one of the reasons why you need women in these jobs, is for young women like you and for young men in this audience to see that women can do them, and do them well. And that's what we needed in our country as we move from conflict to peace. For your daughters and my daughters and your sons and my sons to say, oh, look, here's a good woman. Look at the job she made, look at the difference she made. When we came from such a patriarchal, dare I say it, militaristic, macho, public decision-making institutions, they're the ones that also have to be transformed. So ask yourself, what difference does peace make? You cannot go on having the same old institutions, having the same old decision-makers, having the same old systems, with the same old attitudes. And that's what we, I think, strategically really challenged, and are still challenging in our peace process. That's the hardest job of all.
How did you deal with, I don't know, violence committed by paramilitary groups or dissident groups after the agreement was reached?
In the peace agreement, we said that all prisoners would be released within 2 years of the agreement. We had already released about 20,000 prisoners who had served their time. So we had about 1,000 prisoners still in prison, and we said they will leave prison on condition that they do not rejoin the organisations in which they were members of before they came to prison. Or if they recommit any offence, not just a political offence, a political criminal conviction, they will go back into prison and serve their full sentence. So those were the incentives. But of course everyone thought it was a complete amnesty, that we were thrown open the gates of prisons and letting all these terrorists and criminals walk the streets. They hadn't done. We had already had the experience of many of them remaining very disciplined by their own organisations, and that's what needs to happen here. The danger is if we start fractionalising and forming new movements and dissident groups, that's a real problem. We didn't have that. We were successful in taking all of them with us. And then a small group broke away. So I still go into the prison, and we still have political prisoners, and they're segregated. So the Republicans are on one side of the prison and the Loyalists are on another, and I go in on a frequent basis as part of this disbandment and speak to them and interview them. So we still have a number, a very small number, of groups who are not interested in the peace agreement, who are benefiting from criminality, who are benefiting from gangsterism, and who are using the badge of their old organisations to enforce coercive control in their local communities. The difference is now, it's their own people on their own side who they're enforcing that control on. The war is over, so they're not fighting those on the other side. And so their own people on their own side are saying, we don't want you. You stop this, we're reporting you to the police. So law and order has been restored into areas where the police formerly did not go. We had no-go areas, like you. And that was a big issue for the police, because they were taking a risk of being assassinated. And I am very concerned still that phone calls come in to the police and say it's domestic violence, that the man is abusing his wife, and the police respond that 2 officers were killed as a result. And that's 18 years after our agreement. So you can still see how careful we need to be in enforcing this. It doesn't happen fast, persistence and patience and time, but the police still tell me they still respond to those calls. There's no such thing as a no-go area in Northern Ireland. And so this issue of what do we do with criminality and gangsterism and untouchables, I have to say to you, at the minute, every person in Northern Ireland is watching Netflix and Narcos, and they're all addicted to this. I haven't seen it. And of course the question everybody says is, what direction will Colombia now go in? And will people take a peaceful path? Or will some of them become, and remain against the law? And that was a question for us. It remains a question. There are small groups. They're still spontaneously violent. They still plant the bomb here and there. And it was my job to go and monitor and write this report and make recommendations. There was two things we got wrong. We promised them reintegration. I think you've done that here. It was a promise that wasn't really delivered. We didn't allow them to take up certain jobs and employment. We vetted them and banned them from taking jobs in the public sector, in government jobs, and they then took a big chip on their shoulder and said, we're not human beings, you're not allowing us to do these jobs. So we'll just keep on doing what we always knew best, which was a little bit of criminality and some extortion. That was a mistake, and I have proposed that we remove that and that they do get reintegrated completely. So we call that the carrot. They have no right to travel. They're not allowed to travel to the United States. We're talking about over 40,000 people who are identified. Their children and their children's children are not allowed to travel. I've also come across those who have been turned back at the airport. That's wrong, because grandchildren and children should not be able to suffer the sins of their fathers. And that transgenerational anger is being transmitted. In my report, I said this has to change. And they're not allowed to adopt children. They're not allowed to purchase homes with any loans. They're not allowed to drive taxis. All of these things that they were saying you're not permitted to do. So that was not a genuine reintegration. And I hope Colombia can see that that's remained a problem. So we call that the carrot, because I said I made a number of proposals on how to fully reintegrate. And then I said, and here's the stick. Because if you don't come on this journey with everybody else, then we're going to prosecute you under a new piece of legislation called membership of organised gangs. If there's 5 or more, and they're creating extortion, they're controlling communities, then we're going to prosecute. Scotland has done it very successfully. And so we've been to Scotland and seen what they've done, and we're bringing that legislation in. And there are a number of other things we've said to police officers. That you need to build confidence with the community. I don't know if you know about this concept called restorative justice. I think probably in Colombia you do. The police are not the only people in our country who deliver justice. That tends to be quite a hard, retributive method. You go in, you arrest, you prosecute, you bring to court, you sentence, and you imprison. We call that retributive justice. But we have introduced restorative justice. And it's massive now amongst our communities. Initially it was the politicians did not like it. They said this is the old guerrillas allowed to decide for themselves how justice should be allocated. They've been proved wrong. Restorative justice is now a centre of excellence and a model in local communities, where the local community works with the police work with the victims, the perpetrators are held to account by the local community. And it's very interesting process. And again, as Human Rights Commissioner, I was asked, is it compliant with human rights? And we said, yes, it is. So those two forms of justice are now operating alongside each other. Retributive justice through the courts, and restorative justice with the communities. And it's, I would say that it's progressing very effectively.
¿Más preguntas? Yo tengo una. Uno de los elementos ya dijéramos en la etapa de posconflicto, que el Estado, digamos, en el cual el Estado debe orientar su acción está relacionado con las garantías de no repetición. Y creo que uno de los mecanismos más relevantes para esas garantías de no repetición es precisamente el tema de la educación. En Irlanda hay algún ejercicio, sobre todo, digamos, a nivel de escuelas, de colegios, donde se imparte alguna instrucción para prevenir un futuro conflicto.
The last people that like instructions are teachers. Teachers give instructions, they're not instructed themselves, that's what they tell us. I hope that translates from English into Spanish. So the teachers have to work alongside the advisors, who are the people drafting the new curriculum, and also the Human Rights Commission. The work on the Bill of Rights was very impressive. It was the largest public participation exercise ever undertaken in Northern Ireland. And the children and the schools were a big part of that. So the answer is, as I said earlier, everybody pays attention to human rights defenders, but they should pay attention to human rights educators, because that's where the conflict will not reoccur. If those children now understand the impact. I would love to see this in Colombia happening. I don't know if it's possible. Our guerrilla movements are now inside the schools, with the kids in the schools, talking to the kids, saying, don't do what we did. It's a very impressive movement. Initially, parents were a bit hostile and parents were a bit anxious. Who are these people to come in to talk to our children? But it was a very brave movement that they took on both sides to say, do not join these new organisations. Do not get back involved in the conflict, because all you'll end up doing is getting to prison and never getting to Disneyland, because you'll not be allowed to travel outside the country. So it's a very important message, and it comes from the combatants themselves. So the teachers tell me I want to do it with the combatants, I don't want to do it alone, because the combatants will see the new guerrilla from being organised that night, because the kids take them seriously. So it's one, again in my report, it was a big proposal, that we have a new, it's a very radical proposal for politicians. But they accepted it. And I said it needed to be resourced. They need to be seen as people who can be trusted to do this job, especially with children and young people, because those are the most important minds for the future. And so we're moving also in that direction. So with the documents and the new curriculum, alongside it, we have these local people going into the schools. On the one hand, and most recently, I was so impressed to see a victim stand beside a combatant addressing the children. The victim of the combatant addressing the children. So when I heard Timoshenko saying in Cartagena that he apologised and how sorry he was for the harms committed, we never had anybody say that. Only now is that language, 30 years later, becoming accustomed to people, because both sides felt there was nothing to be sorry about in their conflict, that they had defended their own people. So it was quite good to see that symbolism, and I thought, if that can be carried into the new education system, that's a really positive step.
How did you do to maintain the peace agreement as a part of a state policy and not as a part of a governmental policy?
Sure, it's not. As a government official.
Thank you. Not even government public servants. Often the shortest questions are the most difficult. I think the key to it is that the Good Friday Agreement is an international agreement. It's the agreement is lodged at the United Nations and is protected as an international agreement. Also, the other factor is that the process took a long time to get to the agreement, and there were many political parties participating in it at different times, both in positions of government and then outside of government as well. So there was a degree within Northern Ireland, there was certainly a degree of party politics being played around the agreement, and I'll let Monica explain that more for me to say it publicly. But I think certainly is the two governments, it's an interesting dynamic, I suppose. Northern Ireland was the contested space, where 45% of the population identified themselves as being Irish and affiliated or Irish and associated with Irish culture, and the majority didn't. They considered themselves to be British. So it required a constitutional settlement, and what we have is a complex agreement that's international by nature, and both governments in Dublin and in London are co-guarantors of that agreement, and the architecture of the agreement has put in place systems that allow us to continue to deal with it. So there is a system for dealing with the internal politics of Northern Ireland, that's the Northern Ireland Assembly, of which Monica was a member. There is the relationship between the North and the rest of Ireland, and we have intergovernmental bodies, what we call the North-South Ministerial Council, and they meet on a regular basis and discuss issues of commonalities across the island. And for example, one of the most successful elements of that is Ireland is a country of, well, the island is a country of is an island of 6 million people, but it's also an island that gets approximately 10 million tourists a year. That's like 60 million tourists come to Colombia in 1 year. And we market Ireland as an island. We don't market it as two separate countries. And so we're collaborating on a range of issues that's of mutual interest to everybody in the island. And then we have, between Ireland and the United Kingdom, we have a British-Irish interparliamentary body where parliamentarians from both islands meet together and discuss issues as well. So I think one of the insights of the agreement was to create structures that will last and will continue to last beyond the elected officials that made the agreement. And that's so institutionalized. And Monica can talk, she's experiences of that, and she can talk about the successes and otherwise of how they functioned. But the holistic nature of the agreement means that for it to work, all elements have to be addressed. Internally in Northern Ireland, on the island of Ireland as a whole, and then between Ireland and the United Kingdom as a whole as well.
And this is where Santos had to be very careful in the second accord, because if Santos goes too far and says, I got this, I got this, I got this, the other side are going to say, so we're the big losers. So every agreement is like a tightrope. It's a compromise, it's an accommodation. And so you have to be very careful afterwards that you don't make it out to be a much bigger victory for your side only. So the words I use now is interdependence. So Mandela taught me that in South Africa. He said, South Africa will depend on how good the whites feel and that it cannot just be a country for black people. And I learned that because the whites were going to be a minority. And so black South Africa had to hand out the hand of friendship and say, we are mutually dependent from this country. You once had the power, we have it now, but we are going to make this work together. In Northern Ireland, we really have struggled on that. On the day after the agreement, I thought we had lost it because I went out to do all the public television and radio with my colleagues at the round the table. Apart from the fact that two of the parties had never said good morning to each other after 2 years. So that was the difference that you have in Havana, that at least there's been a recognition of legitimacy, but it's a bigger issue to have coexistence and to have mutual dependency. So your politicians are going to have to be very careful because of one side of the opposition, use this as a stick, you will have potential for going backwards. So these are very, very difficult moments very important moments for you in Colombia. Do not put the goalposts up so high for the other side that they can't get over, they can't shoot the ball over it. If somebody doesn't play rugby, I think I got that right. And that's what we learned. If you start putting the goalposts up too high, the other side have to try and get over it. Then if they get over it, you have to put it up even higher. And we almost lost our agreement because both sides were trying to do that. So now we have this notion of being mutually dependent. But you know what that word is called? Reconciliation. And that's been the biggest issue for us in terms of our agreement. That's the one that we still are working on. And when you have genuine reconciliation, which I think will take a couple more generations, then you have genuine transformation. At the minute, all you can do is manage your conflict, which is what a peace agreement does, and then resolve it through your institutions, whether that be your constitutional arrangements or the new institutions that people have bought into and feel an allegiance to. I love the idea in Colombia that you all are Colombians. We still have that difficulty. And so be proud of that and build on that. And if everybody believes in the country, then they'll want to make it work. At least that's what I think. That's my vision. So I wish you well.